The halls of Westminster have never seen chaos like this. Just 60 seconds ago, breaking news shattered across every screen in Britain. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, the man who promised to restore integrity to Number 10, is on the verge of resignation. What started as a routine television interview exploded into a political earthquake that's sending shockwaves through the entire government. Secret documents, hidden dealings, allegations so devastating they cannot be ignored. The Prime Minister's face went pale as the interviewer laid out evidence that contradicts everything he's told the British public. His hands trembled, his voice cracked, and now senior members of his own party are turning their backs. This isn't speculation anymore. This is happening right now, and what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the leadership of this country. The interview started like any other. Keir Starmer sat confidently in the BBC studio, his familiar composed demeanour intact as the cameras rolled live across the nation. Millions tuned in, expecting the usual political rhetoric. The carefully rehearsed answers about economic policy and healthcare reforms. Nobody, absolutely nobody, anticipated what was about to unfold in the next 11 minutes. The interviewer, armed with documents that had been leaked just hours before, began with a simple question about the Prime Minister's meetings with foreign business executives during his first year in office. Starmer's response was textbook political deflection. He smiled, he nodded, he spoke about transparency and the importance of international relationships. But then the interviewer did something unprecedented. She slid a folder across the desk. The colour drained from Starmer's face as he recognised what was inside. Those documents revealed a pattern of undisclosed meetings, financial arrangements that were never reported to Parliament, and communications that directly contradicted his public statements about conflicts of interest. The evidence was damning. Transaction records showing payments to companies linked to his closest advisors. Email chains discussing policy decisions before they were presented to Cabinet. Meeting logs that proved he had personal involvement in contracts worth hundreds of millions of pounds. And perhaps most explosive of all, recordings of private phone calls where Starmer allegedly discussed ways to keep certain dealings out of the public record. The interviewer gave him a chance to explain. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Starmer's usual eloquence abandoned him. He stuttered. He fumbled for words. He asked for the interview to be paused. The request was denied. This was live television and there was nowhere to hide. As the Prime Minister struggled to formulate a response, his phone began vibrating on the desk once, twice, a dozen times. Messages from panicked advisors watching from Downing Street. Calls from cabinet ministers demanding answers. Texts from party whips trying to control the damage that was spiralling out of control in real time. Starmer tried to regain composure, but every answer he gave only raised more questions. He claimed the meetings were routine diplomatic engagements, but the documents showed they were held in private residences, not official venues. He insisted all financial disclosures had been properly filed, yet the records proved otherwise. He attempted to dismiss some documents as forgeries, but the interviewer produced verification from multiple independent sources, including the government's own archives. The web of contradictions became impossible to untangle. Social media exploded within minutes. The hashtag began trending instantly. Opposition leaders started preparing emergency statements. News networks cleared their schedules to provide continuous coverage of what was quickly becoming the biggest political crisis in a generation. Behind the scenes at Number 10, absolute pandemonium erupted. Senior staff scrambled to develop a response strategy, but they were working with incomplete information. How much did the media actually have? Were there more leaks coming? Who was the source? The questions multiplied faster than answers could be found. Emergency meetings were called, legal teams were assembled, crisis management experts were brought in, but nothing could stop the momentum of what had been set in motion. Within the Labour Party itself, divisions immediately formed. Long-time allies of Starmer rushed to defend him, calling the revelations a coordinated smear campaign. But others, those who had always harboured doubts about his leadership, saw an opportunity. Whispers of a leadership challenge began circulating before the interview had even concluded. Backbench M in PS started calculating their positions. Would standing by Starmer protect their own seats, or would it drag them down with a sinking ship? The constitutional implications were staggering. If a Prime Minister is compromised by undisclosed conflicts of interest, what happens to the legislation passed under their leadership? What about international agreements signed in Britain's name? Legal experts began appearing on news programmes discussing scenarios that had never been seriously contemplated in modern British politics. Some argued that if the allegations were proven, it could trigger a constitutional crisis requiring intervention from the highest levels of government. The opposition seized the moment with ruthless efficiency. Emergency debates were demanded. Calls for immediate investigation echoed through Parliament. Some went further, suggesting that if Starmer did not resign voluntarily, mechanisms would be employed to remove him from office. The political theatre was unprecedented, but beneath the drama lay genuine concerns about the integrity of British democracy itself. The public's trust, already fragile after years of political scandals, was hanging by a thread, and that thread was about to snap. The interview finally ended, but Starmer's nightmare was just beginning. As he removed his microphone and left the studio, cameras captured his ashen face and unsteady gait. The confident leader, who had walked in 40 minutes earlier, was replaced by a man who looked utterly defeated. His security detail rushed him to a waiting car, but not before reporters surrounded the vehicle, shouting questions that would receive no answers. The journey back to Downing Street took 12 minutes during which the Prime Minister's entire political career flashed before his eyes. He had fought so hard to reach this position, to lead the Labour Party out of the wilderness and into government. He had promised a new era of honesty and accountability, and now those very principles were being used to dismantle everything he had built. The irony was not lost on him, and it showed in his expression as the car pulled through the famous black gates. Inside number 10, the atmosphere was suffocating. Staff members who had dedicated themselves to this administration now faced an uncertain future. Some were angry, feeling betrayed by a leader they had trusted. Others were in denial, convinced this was all a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with the right explanation. But most were simply scared of losing their jobs, their reputations, their place in history. The Prime Minister's inner circle gathered in the cabinet room for what everyone knew would be the most important meeting of their lives. No official agenda was set because the only item that mattered was survival. Could Keir Starmer survive this? Should he even try? The debate that followed was brutal and honest in ways that political discussions rarely are. His chief of staff laid out the facts with clinical precision. The evidence against him was substantial and verifiable. Media organisations had confirmed they possessed even more damaging material that had not yet been released. Several cabinet ministers were already distancing themselves publicly. The political mathematics were devastating. Internal party polling conducted in emergency fashion during and immediately after the interview showed catastrophic damage. Starmer's approval ratings had collapsed by 28 points in under an hour. More significantly, the party's overall standing had plummeted. Seats that Labour had won by comfortable margins were now considered vulnerable. The Conservative opposition was preparing for a potential general election, sensing blood in the water. Focus groups convened hastily reported that voters felt fundamentally betrayed. The specific details of the financial allegations mattered less than the broader perception that Starmer was just another politician who said one thing and did another. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild, especially when the breaking happens so spectacularly and so publicly. The Chief of Staff finished his assessment with a conclusion that hung heavy in the room. If the Prime Minister remained in office, the party would likely face electoral annihilation. If he resigned immediately, there was a chance, however slim, of salvaging something from the wreckage. But resignation is not a simple decision for a Prime Minister. Constitutional procedures must be followed. The monarch must be informed. Arrangements for transitional leadership must be established. And perhaps most importantly, the admission of guilt implied by resignation would have legal ramifications that extended far beyond politics. Lawyers advised that stepping down could be interpreted as acknowledgement that the allegations were true, potentially exposing Starmer to criminal investigations. Financial irregularities of the type alleged could constitute fraud or corruption under British law. The prospect of not just losing power but facing actual prosecution added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Yet staying in office seemed equally untenable. The opposition had already tabled a motion of no confidence, scheduled for an emergency session the following day. Even if Starmer managed to survive the vote through party loyalty, the damage to his authority would be irreparable. A Prime Minister who limps through a confidence vote is a Prime Minister in name only. As the meeting continued into its third hour, news arrived that changed everything. 3 senior cabinet ministers had submitted their resignations: the Foreign Secretary, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the Home Secretary. The 3 most powerful positions after the Prime Minister himself had all decided they could no longer serve in Starmer's government. Their resignation letters, leaked immediately to the press, of course, expressed grave concerns about the revelations and the need to restore public trust in government. The message was clear and devastating. If the Prime Minister would not resign, his own cabinet would force his hand by abandoning him. The strategy was politically lethal. A government cannot function without these key positions filled. And the resignations would trigger a cascade effect among junior ministers and parliamentary private secretaries. Within hours, Starmer could find himself leading a government that existed only on paper. The Chief of Staff looked across the table at his Prime Minister and spoke the words everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say. It's over. There's no path forward. You have to resign. The room fell silent. Everyone waited for Keir Starmer to speak, to make the decision that would define the final chapter of his political life. But he said nothing. He simply stood up, walked to the window overlooking Downing Street, and stared out at the gathering crowds and media vehicles that had transformed the street into a circus. Protesters had already begun arriving, some demanding his resignation, others surprisingly defending him against what they called a media coup. The divisions in the country were playing out in miniature right outside his window. After what felt like an eternity, Starmer turned back to face his team. His voice, when he finally spoke, was different. Gone was the hesitation and uncertainty from the interview. In its place was something harder, more resolved. He began by acknowledging the gravity of the situation and the validity of some concerns raised by the documents. But then he did something unexpected. He started fighting back. He outlined a strategy for challenging the narrative that had been constructed around the leaks. Starmer pointed out inconsistencies in the timeline presented by the media. He questioned the motivations of those who had leaked the documents, suggesting they were taken out of context to maximise damage. He referenced legal precedents that would support his interpretation of disclosure requirements. Most importantly, he reminded everyone in the room why they had entered politics in the first place: to fight for ordinary people, to make a difference, to not surrender when things got difficult. The speech was vintage Starmer, the barrister building a case, the politician rallying his troops. For a moment, just a moment, some in the room felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps there was a way through this. Perhaps the Prime Minister could launch a counter-offensive, hold a press conference, present his evidence, and turn the tide of public opinion. But that glimmer died quickly when the Director of Communications interrupted with more devastating news. A second wave of revelations was about to hit. Another media organisation had obtained recordings of Starmer discussing policy positions privately that directly contradicted his public statements to Parliament. The recordings, set to be broadcast within the hour, would prove beyond doubt that the Prime Minister had knowingly misled the House of Commons on multiple occasions. Misleading Parliament is a resignation-level offence under the Ministerial Code. There are no exceptions, no mitigating circumstances that make it acceptable. Every modern Prime Minister who has been definitively proven to have misled Parliament has resigned or been forced from office. The Constitutional Convention is absolute. Starmer knew this as well as anyone. He had, after all, spent years as Director of Public Prosecutions before entering politics. The law, the rules, the standards of public office, these were things he had built his entire career upon. And now those very standards were demanding his departure. The fight drained out of him as quickly as it had appeared. His shoulders slumped, his carefully constructed defence collapsed. He sat back down and asked for the room to be cleared except for his closest advisors. What happened in the next 20 minutes will probably never be fully known. No official record was kept, no minutes were taken. But those who were present would later describe it as one of the most emotionally raw moments they had ever witnessed in politics. Starmer, finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of what was happening, broke down. He spoke about his parents, working class people who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities they never had. He talked about the promises he had made to voters, to party members, to himself. He reflected on where things had gone wrong, the compromises that had seemed small at the time but had accumulated into this catastrophic failure. He expressed regret not for being caught, but for having made the choices that led to this moment in the first place. His advisors, some of whom had been with him for decades, struggled to maintain their own composure. This was not just the end of a premiership, it was the end of a dream, a vision for what Britain could be, now shattered beyond repair. When Starmer finally composed himself, he made the decision. He would resign. Not immediately, but soon. He wanted one final opportunity to address Parliament, to explain his side, to maintain some shred of dignity in departure. The logistics were set in motion. A draft resignation speech was prepared. The palace was informally notified that an announcement would be coming. Party leadership was alerted that they needed to begin the process of selecting an interim leader. But even as these preparations unfolded, the political world outside Number 10 continued to spiral. The opposition had obtained the same recordings that were about to be broadcast and released excerpts on social media. The snippets, carefully selected for maximum impact, showed Starmer saying things about immigration policy, economic strategy and foreign affairs that were fundamentally different from his public positions. The betrayal felt by his own party members was palpable. MPs who had defended his policies, who had voted in line with his direction, now discovered that they had been supporting positions that the Prime Minister himself did not actually believe in. The fury was not just from the opposition, but from within Labour itself.